Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Is everyone there?
Hi.
Hi. Good afternoon, and welcome to Centre for London's second webinar of the week. We're talking about London's renters, talking about how the current COVID-19 crisis is affecting them, what support is available, and what it means for the longer term. I'm Richard Brown. I'm Deputy Director at Centre for London, and we are London's dedicated think tank. We develop new solutions to London's critical challenges. We work towards London being a fairer and more prosperous global city, and we publish research, we stage events, and we try to influence policymakers. And at the moment, like everyone else, we're really focused on the impact of coronavirus, the impact of the crisis we're dealing with now, and it's affecting every part of city life. It's affecting all parts of society. It's showing up some of the tensions and some of the inequalities within our city, but it's also spurring new activity, new policy initiatives, and new community initiatives to try and tackle some of those problems. So I think today should be about the problems that people are facing, but also about what some of the things we can learn out of this are, what some of the things we can take forward as the city recovers. So today, as I said, we're talking about London's renters, and we're really pleased to be joined by the panel we have today. We have Wilkinson, Policy Manager for Generation Rent.
Hi.
We have Tom Copley, Deputy Mayor for Housing and Residential Development.
Hello.
And we have Ben Beadle, Chief Executive of the National Residential Landlords Association.
Hi, folks.
In terms of format, we're learning with this, so please bear with us if anything's clunky. But in terms of format, our speakers will share some insights, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Now, some people will be joining us on Zoom, and they should be able to submit questions through the Q&A function to be found at the bottom of the screen. Others may be joining us through our online streaming, and if you wish to raise a question, can you use put it on Twitter and use the hashtag LDN responds, and that will then be fed into the Q&A process. We're going to get through as many questions as we can before 6 p.m. And we're also going to run a couple of polls that will perhaps get some views and some engagement from the audience. Last thing to say is we also have the usual chat function available. And if there are thoughts you want to raise, you may not want to raise a question that you want to throw out there, please feel free to use the chat function to do that. So I'll ask the first polling question now, and if we can get ready to put that poll up, and then we'll just introduce the topic for a moment or two. The first question is, do you think London's renters are being fairly treated in this current crisis? And we'll come back to the results in a few minutes, but please vote right now. In terms of background, London is a city, a growing city of renters. And over the recent years, as many people here will know, I suspect, that has shifted from social rented sector to the private rented sector, which has risen from 15 to 25% of households over the past couple of decades, while social rent and owner occupation has fallen. And that experience hasn't been great for everyone. Overcrowding in the private renter sector has doubled over that period, and levels of poverty, households living in poverty in private renting, have been rising significantly. We have seen policy responses from registers of road landlords to landlord licensing schemes by individual boroughs. Even central government has picked up on this with their plans to abolish no-fault evictions, which were proposed under the last government and have been confirmed, or I don't think enacted under this. And the mayor has made this a strong priority as well, pushing for a strengthened regime on landlord registration, on rent control, and on capped rent rises. But this has all been made to feel rather urgent by the coronavirus crisis. Both the crisis itself and the restrictions on movement pose challenges for London's renters, many of whom are in insecure employment, many of whom are already financially stressed. Some analysis I saw from Dataloft suggested that a 20% cut in pay that many people are seeing because they're on furlough or because they're taking pay cuts for other reasons would push average proportion of gross salary on rent from 30 to 38%. So there's a feeling of greater stress within the sector. So the mayor has set out some proposals to help London's renters, and I'll ask Tom to talk about those and Ben to respond in a few minutes. But first of all, I think we'll go to Caitlin, but let's see if we can see the first results of the polls first. Can we see those up now? So not entirely negative, but certainly not entirely positive either. A small majority feeling that London's renters are mostly not being treated fairly, but quite a split ticket there. So I think there's a range of views. I'm going to ask Caitlin to speak. While she is, if there's thoughts on people's individual experiences of landlord behaviour or what's been going on during the crisis, please feel free to throw those up using the chat function. But Caitlin, your thoughts?
Thank you, Richard. I think it's really important that we're discussing this today because Londoners are in a really difficult situation of being both at the centre of the UK's housing crisis and the centre of the pandemic. There's higher infection rates in London than anywhere else in this country. And London's renters went into this crisis paying on average 50, even 60% of their income on rent, which is, again, higher than anywhere else in the country. Quality of housing is also an issue, as it appears that the disease spreads quicker in areas of high overcrowding. And for renters who are in houses of multiple occupation or sharing facilities, it's almost impossible to stop the spread of coronavirus. I think when you take all of this into account, it's probably not surprising that Londoners are more worried about their housing situation than the rest of the country. Polling that was conducted last month regarding the pandemic found that 3/4 of London's renters were worried about their housing situation, compared to almost half of people nationally. And at Generation Rent, we've heard in the last couple of months from renters worried about a huge range of topics. There are people who are still facing eviction notices, people worried about moving home in this period who are due to move before the pandemic started, people worried about staying healthy in shared houses, or who don't know what to do if a letting agent or a landlord really is insisting on coming around to the property. But the most common problem that we've heard from renters is those who've lost income and simply can't afford to pay their rent, as you mentioned in your opening remarks. Lots of people aren't eligible for universal credit or the government's furlough scheme. And for those who can claim, lots of renters in London just find it just doesn't cover the rent. And this is a particular problem for renters in London. Local housing allowance was recently raised to cover the lower 30% of market rents, but Londoners face the biggest gaps between their benefits and their housing costs. It can be as much as they can be facing a shortfall of over £1,000 in certain London boroughs. And the wait for universal credit and LHA is also a huge problem because renters are reporting that the benefits system is slower than usual and there's a 5-week wait built in, which puts them at risk of arrears immediately. And yeah, I think lots of the renters that get in touch with us tell us about the impact this is having on their mental health. One renter told us this month that the problems with paying for their rent was keeping them up at night, and they felt that the 3-month eviction ban only buys them time if they're not able to afford their rent. And yeah, obviously renters who can't make payments are advised by government to speak to their landlord and agree a rent reduction or a repayment plan. But at this stage, it does seem like it's a complete lottery whether that's possible for them. We've heard from renters who've successfully negotiated a reduction and of landlords who have been proactively offering very generous and permanent rent reductions or rent holidays. But then we're also aware of some really concerning practice. We've heard from some letting agents demanding rent in full. Some people, we've even heard of Section 21 notices being served as a precaution. If the rent isn't paid back in full by a certain amount of time, then these renters will face eviction. Some landlords are point blank refusing, and I'm sure Ben will be able to let us know a bit more about how some landlords just might not be in a position to grant one at all. I think what it's really shown, though, is that renters' safety and security shouldn't be left up to individual goodwill or individual good circumstance of landlords, and it's time for the government to provide more certainty. We're really worried that without additional funding and protection, there's going to be huge numbers of renters in London and across the country that aren't going to be able to pay their rent and will be facing an eviction, and they'll be facing eviction in June. We're calling on government to go further by providing increased protection from eviction and more support to pay the rent in the form of LHA. But I'm sure I'm looking forward to hearing what other panelists and what the audience have to say about what they think that the solutions are to this problem.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Caitlin. That's a really helpful overview. Feel free, by the way, everyone, start throwing in any questions. I can see we've got one or two already. Tom, can you give an idea of the Mayor's response and how that's going down with government, but also, what resources there are out there for tenants who are feeling under pressure right now?
Yes, thanks very much. And it is very, very good that we're having this discussion this evening. Like 28% of Londoners now, I'm a private tenant, and I have been ever since I moved to London. And it's an interesting fact that more Londoners now rent from a private landlord than own a home with a mortgage. So while the government's announcement of a mortgage holiday was very welcome, it was welcomed by the Mayor, the lack of support for tenants affects even more Londoners, and that's very concerning. In terms of what the government have done, the temporary eviction ban is welcome, but that hasn't, as Caitlin said, stopped landlords from issuing eviction notices. A lot of tenants won't wait for the notice period or to go through the courts. They will simply leave the property when they get the eviction notice because they don't know that there has to be a court process to formally evict. So one thing that the Mayor is calling on the government to do is to ban landlords from issuing eviction notices, so we don't end up with tenants in that situation. But the biggest thing that the Mayor is calling for concerns eviction, but also support for rent payments. So the Mayor is calling for a triple lock. And what this would do, firstly, is make sure that the welfare and benefits system covers in full any shortfall in rent where tenants are unable to pay because they are affected by COVID-19. And that doesn't just mean people who have got the virus, people who are affected by it, for example, because they have lost their job as a result of their company laying them off or going out of business, for example. The second part of the triple lock is to do with protecting tenants after COVID-19. So what this would mean is making what Section 8 eviction on the grounds of arrears discretionary, so that where tenants have accrued any arrears due to COVID-19, they won't subsequently be able to be evicted after the crisis. And finally, of course, is a policy that the Mayor and indeed the government had anyway, which is to end Section 21 no-fault eviction. That package of measures taken together should go a long way to protecting tenants. And in particular, the issue around the 3-month ban on eviction, I'm very concerned, and the Mayor is very concerned, that once you get to the end of that 3-month period, suddenly you're going to end up with a huge number of evictions, which not only is going to overwhelm the court system, it's also going to overwhelm local authority homelessness services as well, if we have many, many people being made evicted all at the same time. So it's very important that we have these protections in place to prevent that from happening. In terms of some of the actions the Mayor has been taking, unfortunately, of course, the Mayor of London, unlike the Mayor of many cities around the world, has almost no powers over the private rented sector whatsoever. But he has established the rogue landlord and agent checker, which has proved to be very popular. It's had 220,000 searches since it was introduced. And in terms of what support for tenants and what tenants can do during the crisis if they have any problems, I would strongly advise any tenant who has any issues to phone the shelter advice line in the first instance. They are always excellent at offering advice. And I would also suggest that tenants take a look on the City Hall website. There is a whole page on there which goes through the rights that tenants have, so that tenants are aware of what landlords can and can't do, in particular during the crisis in terms of eviction.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tom. That's a really helpful overview. Getting a few questions and comments coming in now, and I'll come back to those in a few moments. But Ben, could I get your response? Could you say a little bit, and interestingly enough, this has already been picked up in some of the questions, could you say a little bit about what we know about London's residential landlords? Because obviously for a lot of them, this is a crisis as well. So say a bit about them and how you think landlords should be responding to the Mayor's proposals?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a few things. I think, at a time of national crisis, landlords have got to play their part. So, rather controversially, we supported what the government put out, the initial response in terms of banning evictions, because, and if there are landlords on here, I'm happy to say, now is not the right time to be evicting your tenants. Everyone's got a part to play. I appreciate there's wider issues in the sector, and those need to be dealt with, and no doubt we'll come on to those later on in the discussion. And I know it's really difficult for landlords. I'm a landlord myself, but now's not the time to be booting people out on the street. And actually, what we have seen, whilst we have seen, as Caitlin says, at the some elements on the periphery, generally what we are seeing is a reflectiveness of the satisfaction that exists in the PRS. So the last survey, English Home Survey of a year or so ago, reported 84% satisfaction in the PRS, and actually we are seeing landlords negotiating and discussing with their tenants in a really appropriate way, and in a way that I don't know whether you would have expected it or not, but it's a way that does demonstrate that not everything is quite broken in the private rented sector. And my advice to landlords is you don't become a bad tenant overnight. And actually, when you look at the average length of tenancy in the PRS, which is in excess of 4 years, actually, there's plenty of scope for landlords and tenants to be able to work through this. So our expectation as an organisation is that we will play our part, and we will signpost landlords and tenants to information that will help them sustain their tenancy and enter into the right sort of conversations with their tenants. And we've put up things like agreements, short-term agreements to defer some rents, or in some cases write it off entirely. But as you said at the outset, if we talk about the composition of the average landlord, some landlords have broader shoulders than others, and I think that what we refer to in terms of how landlords are made up in the PRS is perhaps showing that the PRS is slightly more fragile than we perhaps thought it might be. In a way, we're looking at the wider economy and thinking, actually, we probably thought there was a bit more fat in the economy to get us through all of the things that are happening. And I don't think housing is any exception to that. But in answer to your question, it's quite difficult to actually pinpoint London landlords, because they may not necessarily live in London. But typically what we know about the landlord audience is that 94% of them are individuals rather than companies. And a lot of them will probably only have 2 to 3, 4 properties on average. So those landlords are experiencing similar sorts of pain as tenants are. And whilst we can encourage take up of the mortgage deferment, and I call it a deferment because I associate holidays with good things, and a mortgage holiday has to be repaid back by the landlord at the end of the loan. And I think there's some misconceptions around what a mortgage holiday actually means, and that's transcended into confusion for tenants, thinking that somehow that they get a rent holiday off the back of it. So a mortgage deferment is welcome, but it does need to be paid back. And those landlords that do take out a mortgage deferment, do need to pass on those savings to their tenant, either in a deferred way or in a write-off way if they can. Now, we have seen some really positive news stories in terms of how landlords are helping their tenants, whether they're vulnerable or not, or whether they're taking into account their specific scenarios around furlough and work and availability to pay. And I would actually, for the record, agree with my friend at Generation Rent that the point that we have in our discussions with government is that we need to put money in people's pockets to allow them to actually be able to afford or go about their business, as it were, as far as close to normal as possible. So looking at the 5-week wait on housing allowance, or universal credit rather, and also looking at a temporary increase on housing allowance, to be able to afford those rents is also something that we would support. And the main reason we would support those types of things is because actually there aren't any other remedies out there for landlords. There aren't any specific measures that landlords can benefit from. And so whilst it's all well and good for me to be able to encourage landlords to pass on savings to their tenants, actually what we have is potentially quite a squeezed landlord that's not getting any of their revenue in. Whether or not they have a mortgage to pay, in some cases, I've been told is largely irrelevant because they use those costs for other lifestyle to live on. And then we have sort of increased costs around if properties are vacant, council tax, and other bits and pieces. I mean, it is a little bit of a perfect storm, and it does show a degree of fragility that exists in the private rented sector. So in summary, I'm encouraging landlords, and the organisation is encouraging landlords to play their part, sustain their tenancy, work with their tenant in order to do that, and really remind them that, as I say, you don't become a bad tenant overnight. I think there is a difference where landlords, when we get through to the other side and we look at picking up or releasing some of the measures that have been put in place, there needs to be a bit of differential on that on that point, and no doubt we will get into it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ben. I'm just going to ask quick perspective from Caitlin, and then I've got quite a lot of questions coming up, so we'll get into that. Caitlin, your thought on the Mayor's proposals and how the landlord sector is responding to those?
I think that broadly the Mayor's proposals are a good thing. I think it's very important that renters are protected from both eviction and are given support to pay their rent so that the arrears are lessened. I think what's particularly interesting in the Mayor's proposals is the changes to Section 8 that would make it harder permanently to evict tenants for rent arrears in this period. We would go slightly further and amend Section 8 so that was not even a discretionary ground and that it couldn't be used for arrears built up during the pandemic. But I think the Mayor's absolutely right to call for more protections for renters. And I think this has to be something that isn't, it's not reliant on goodwill or individual circumstance. There needs to be legislative change.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got a few questions coming up, and two of the first ones, I'm not going to read out people's names, so I don't think we agreed that we were going to, but two of the first ones take quite strongly differing positions. One asking whether the panel feels it's fair that a tenant's living situation is just down to the good grace of their landlord, and highlighting what you might call the power imbalance between a landlord who has assets to fall back on and a tenant who may not, and whether in the light of that the panel supported the rent strikes being organised across London. I suspect I know what panellists might say on that, but it would be useful to perhaps think of that one alongside another question, which is from a landlord who feels that landlords are left in the lurch with tenants who are demanding rent reductions, despite the fact they receive all their income working from home, and landlords feeling very pressured to simply accept no money from some tenants who they feel are acting unreasonably and taking advantage of the situation. So clearly something that's happening here is some of these positions are feeling a little bit polarised. What can one do to sort of, I suppose the question pulling those two together is what one might do to sort of bridge the gap between those positions. Tom?
Well, I mean, I would argue that the Mayor's position does just that, because it's not saying that that tenants stop paying their landlord's rent. It's saying that if tenants can't pay their rent, then the welfare state does what the welfare state should do and step in. I think perhaps because of 10 years of cuts to welfare and welfare reductions and caps, we've almost lost sight of the fact that the welfare system is meant to be there to step in just these kinds of situation. And that's exactly what the Mayor's proposals would do. I would just say this, I completely agree with the point that's made about the power imbalance between tenants and landlords. And, Ben, I don't doubt that there are some landlords, and we have a lot of amateur landlords in this country who do rely very much on rental income, but there are a lot who don't. It's an extra. And also, I just don't think you can compare people who own what is a very valuable asset and say that they're as vulnerable as someone who doesn't own a valuable asset. That's not to say that some landlords don't have issues, and if rent stops being paid, that's a very bad thing for them. But I just don't think that you can make that comparison. It's not on the same level.
Well, if I might just come back on that point, I think I would agree to a point if you could actually liquidate that asset. And the point is, at the moment, landlords wouldn't be able to easily sell and liquidate that asset and mitigate some of those losses. I think as far as the power imbalance is concerned, I think it raises a wider issue. Maybe this is for the end of the programme in terms of what we might end up learning from it. But I think for me, I mean, I've only been in this role for 6 months, and prior to that, I was involved in dispute resolution between landlords and tenants. It strikes me actually that tenants perhaps don't have a full sense of awareness around some of the laws and avenues that are out there and available to them, because from my vantage point, I've got landlords telling me that actually everything's for the tenant, and I've got tenants telling me that everything's for the landlord. Somewhere we need to arrive at a fair system that works for both landlords and tenants. So I would reiterate your call that if tenants are having difficulty to talk to shelter, because there's a plethora of laws out there that protects them. The slight problem is that there's very little that's done in terms of enforcing some of those existing laws that are out there. And I would like nothing more than to remove bad and criminal landlords from the sector, because they have no part to play. But that's a longer term goal rather than a short term game. So I think this power balance, that there's arguments on both sides, and we need to make it a fairer place for both parties, I think.
Brilliant. I'm going to bring in another question now, just because I want to get through as many as possible, so I won't necessarily fire every question at every. We've got a couple here. There's a slightly different issues, but I'm going to raise them. One is someone asking about feeling under great pressure, this person from they have mental health issues, feeling that if government was only paying 100% of median rents, and I think that's the point about the local housing allowance, that would give more security and more reassurance. And I suspect that's something that panelists will probably agree with. It would be interesting to hear perhaps from Tom in a moment how those discussions with government are going, if that's getting a good hearing. I've got a question from someone who's a build-to-rent landlord, whose name I recognise, about this sector, which has obviously been growing in London, more professionalised, tending to be backed by institutional investment. Perhaps a question to Caitlin, whether you see build-to-rent landlords acting in a different and more professional, maybe more professional way towards tenants. And a third question, which is, and I'll come back to, there's a few more here as well, which we picked up from Twitter, and I'll read it because I don't fully understand it myself. Most tenants in London's rental sector have paid large deposits to landlords and agents. What's stopping landlords using these as collateral during the national crisis? And is it right for them to do so? I guess that's landlords living off the deposits for a period, which I suspect isn't technically legal. But perhaps we could, Tom, perhaps we could pick up first on the LHA and how that's going with government, and then we'll talk about the other two questions, the build-to-rent sector and how landlords use deposits. Tom.
Well, it's an ongoing discussion with the government. I mean, they did make a step in the right direction when Rishi Sunak announced that LHA rates would be restored to the 30th percentile, although that is only taking us back to a few years ago when George Osborne froze it. So there is a long way to go. We think at the very least, in general anyway, it should be the 50th percentile, but for due to the crisis, if someone is affected by COVID-19, then the LHA cap should be suspended, and also the benefit cap as well, because this is another important point. It's no good just raising LHA caps if people are then caught by the benefit cap, so that has to be included as well. But it's an ongoing discussion. I think as the crisis goes on, what I hope will happen is that the government does see that renters need more protection. It took them a few weeks to begin with to take the first steps that they've already done. I hope that as time goes on and the end of this 3-month moratorium on eviction looms, they will see there'll be another crisis in terms of homelessness if they don't take action to protect tenants from evictions. and to cover rents.
You're muted,
You're
Richard.
muted, Richard.
Sorry. Can't even share it. Caitlin, perhaps you can say something about perceptions of the build to rent sector. Does it feel like it acts differently to the traditional PRS?
Yeah, I'm going to be honest and say that it likely does act differently to the PRS, to the traditional PRS, in that we've not had a single complaint come in that specifically referenced that someone is living in a build to rent accommodation. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm giving the sector a clean bill of health. It might be that people just don't refer to it in that way. I do think most of the issues we're seeing are with individual landlords. People usually refer to individual landlords and negotiations between the two. So I'm going to take a measured I'm not sure. It seems that so, and it could just be because the build to rent sector still makes up a relatively small proportion of the PRS in London. I know it's growing. We've not heard a huge amount so far, so I can't comment further. I can mention deposits if that's at all of use.
Yes, say something on that, please.
Yeah, so in answer to the question, if a tenant is in arrears, a landlord at the end of the tenancy is able to use the deposit to make those back if they're owed money. But what I would say here is that the deposit is the tenant's money up until the point that the landlord makes a successful deduction. So, and due process has to be followed at the end of a tenancy. So I wouldn't encourage any landlords to be trying at this stage to rely on deposits. That's not an appropriate action unless, you know, unless it's at the end of the tenancy and has followed quite a specific process for a specific situation. I don't think using tenants' deposit money is the answer.
Richard, if I might just come in on that point, I spent 8 years running a deposit scheme, so would absolutely reiterate what Caitlin has said. The deposit is the tenant's money; don't touch it. I think the one thing I would just say, you know, a lot of landlords tend to use a custodial scheme that that it's lodged with the scheme provider anyway, so they wouldn't be able to get to it. But you know, that money's sat there not doing a lot. And one of the things that I've been discussing with MHCLG is actually, if you have got a really good relationship with your tenant, if they've been in your property for a long period of time, why not give it some of them back? Why not help their cash flow if you can get access to it? And so, you know, we need to, there's £4.5 billion sat there not doing very much. There's a lot of money tied up in deposits. And that is one, it shows a good trust between the landlord and the tenant. It won't be right for everybody, but you know, there's more than one way to skin a cat in this particular crisis, and we should look at all opportunities. I think the other thing, just in relation to build to rent, I spent a couple of years working with build to rent providers before I took this position, and one of the things that comes up in our surveys is that landlords with larger property portfolios are likely to be more severely impacted, but with somebody like a build to rent provider, arguably they might have slightly broader shoulders within which to carry some of that burden. I'm generalizing, but our survey showed that landlords with 20 plus properties are likely to be more adversely affected than smaller ones. So I just put that out there as well.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to ask 3 more questions. I'm going to start, I think, moving on to talk about what we might take out of this for the future. So in preparation for that, I think just while I ask these next questions, we're going to put the next poll up, which is about what people's anticipation for the future is, whether people think conditions will improve for London's renters after lockdown is eased. So if people could vote on that over the next few minutes, then we'll come back to some of those long-term questions. 3 more questions I've picked out. One is, given the rise in people claiming universal credit, and given that many private landlords, 40% I think was quoted, have a ban on renters in receipt of housing benefit, is that going to create more of a problem for some of the people suffering extreme stress at the moment, particularly people looking for new tenancies, and there are some of those at the moment? And then 2, I suppose, slightly longer term issues, where landlords are having difficulty, difficulty meeting their mortgage payments, and are themselves in distress. Is the scope for the GLA or local authorities to buy out landlords, help them to liquidate their assets? And the third question is, comparing to the commercial sector, where a lot of tenants have been getting long-term rent reductions from their landlords, and there's certainly been a tactic on high streets across the country. Given the possible impact on London of the coronavirus crisis, is the scope to talk about longer-term rent reductions, as well as short-term measures such as rent holidays? Perhaps start asking Tom about the extent to which the GLA or local authorities can step in if landlords are in distress.
So it wouldn't be the GLA, but it could be local government. Quite a few local authorities have been sort of gradually buying back homes that they were forced to sell via right to buy. A lot of those right to buy properties, in fact, according to work that I did a few years ago, 42% of the homes sold under right to buy in London are actually in the hands of private landlords, which is a whole other issue in itself. So yes, there's no reason why local authorities couldn't be buying back properties. In fact, some of them are already doing it. And it may be that as the crisis goes on, if we do see big fall in demand, fall in house prices, that local authorities might wish to expand the number of homes that they're buying back. And just a more general point on housing, and this is more where some of the general point on housing in general, and this is coming to new build properties. If there is a recession, there may be scope, if we have support from the government, for us to support housing associations and councils to buy up entire new build private blocks and switch them over to social housing. That's something that that we're exploring as well.
Brilliant. Thank you. Perhaps for Ben and Caitlin, I could ask you both the other two questions. Is there a challenge of people on universal credit getting somewhere to live, and to what extent do you think we might see a permanent adjustment down in rents, residential rents in London?
I think as far as universal credit is concerned, it's very clear landlords shouldn't be picking and choosing on that particularly, and I suspect if they've been burnt during this crisis, that will only help the cause, as it were, of landlords accepting tenants on benefits. I think the fact of the matter is that it's more likely to be an issue for a tenancy that's in train, as it were, rather than new tenancies. Mm-hmm. So I seriously don't expect this to be a barrier particularly. I think as long as landlords will need to do their due diligence and perhaps have a guarantor and so forth in the usual way, but I don't think that would put them off particularly. The other, I might just draw an analogy there, that I think there is a perception with landlords with the removal of Section 21 that they might be slightly more picky with the types of tenants that they accept in their properties. But I don't think I referenced this earlier. We're not campaigning for Section 21 to stay. Actually, we accept that that's a done deal. And actually, some of the things that we want to speak about are having by getting rid of Section 21 doesn't mean that landlords aren't going to be able to get possession of their properties back. There has to be a sensible conversation that, unfortunately, if you don't pay, or if you're in an abusive, you're abusing other neighbours or antisocial behaviour, you're going to get evicted at some point. And getting rid of Section 21 isn't going to save you from that. Actually, the eviction process is fundamentally broken. It's broken for both parties. It doesn't work for anybody. And it's why we are pushing the government to look at alternative ways of dealing with it post this crisis. Because if it didn't work before the crisis, it's not going to work very well once it reopens. So I think having a sensible conversation around possession reforms is really, really necessary. I'm sorry, I've forgotten about the other question that you asked me. You're muted, sorry.
The other question was about long-term rent reductions.
Sure, I think
permanent, but whether this will see an adjustment down.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that the figures I've got in London in the last year, there was only a modest increase of 1.2% to March. So we're not seeing huge increases as an average. Actually, what we saw in Hampton's report on Monday was that more tenants are renewing their tenancy, and that would seem to me to be a sensible approach in the current situation. It's not the right time to be increasing rents. I've been very clear about that. Forget it. It's a nonsense. Let's revisit it in 6 months' time when things hopefully settle down in some way, shape, or form. But the issue with regards to rents and affordability is one that's driven by supply. And actually, as Tom says, actually having a look at or making sure that there's more affordable homes to rent is probably one of the answers in that. The market is pretty good at regulating itself. Rents are high in London. It's where people want to be. I live out in zone 6, so I don't pay quite as much, but it is the place that people want to be. And there is a lack of supply that drives those rents that drives those rents up. And if you have a greater supply, that will even out in terms of rents in the long term.
Thank you. Caitlin, a couple of observations from you, and then we're going to move to a few new questions.
Yeah, I think I take a slightly different approach to improving affordability in London. I think, obviously London was in a massive affordability crisis before coronavirus hit. One of the things that we have proposed is that for 12 months in this crisis, we're proposing a freeze on existing tenancies so that landlords can't put the rent up. Across the sector, rents are no longer, it doesn't look like rents are going up anymore as more tenants stay put, but that hasn't stopped a minority. We've had people get in touch with tenants facing rent increases of over 10% in the middle of a pandemic. While not all landlords do that, some can, and they do. And I think we're talking about security here and reforming Section 21, and security of tenure will also be undermined if you can still, as a landlord, legally hit a tenant with a rent increase that they can't pay. And we saw last week that the housing minister confirmed that landlords would still be able to put the rent up in a crisis. So I think at the very least, we're calling for a freeze for the next 12 months. As you said, Ben, it's not the time to be putting rents up anyway, but it doesn't stop probably a minority, but people are allowed to. So that is one thing that we would call for. But I think the question of affordability in London is one that probably can't be tackled in the
Richard, I wonder if I might just come back in there. I think briefly, you've got affordability, you've got tenure, you've got eviction. It's a bit like the Colonel's secret recipe. You need a little bit of everything to make it work. I don't think there's a one size fits all here.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got a lot of questions coming through and a lot of comments. I think there's been a few questions. I think it just opens up a big other topic about what we can do to ensure new supply of housing overall, which is clearly a big agenda for the Mayor and for Tom and probably for everyone in this room. But I think that's a whole separate set of discussions, so I probably won't touch on that right now. Discussions of whether UBI would make a difference. UBI tends to come up in these discussions. Discretionary housing payments by local authorities, whether those could help some of these issues. And as there's two more questions before we look to the future a bit. One, what can we do in terms of delivering actual affordable homes for Londoners, affordable for Londoners on average salaries? Is there anything more we can be doing there for rent or sale? And secondly, what are the chances? What are the options for resisting and stopping illegal evictions if people are feeling in trouble? Is that something else they should go to shelter about? Tom, thoughts on those two?
So in terms of affordable housing, of course, we've got the Mayor's affordable home building programme, which this year is on track to meet the government target of 17,000 affordable homes. And that would mean that would be a record-breaking figure. That would be the most since records on this began, which was around 2001, 2002. But it's still not enough because we don't have enough funding from the government. We're very reliant on the government to provide us with funding. At the moment, we get on average around £700 million a year to fund councils and housing associations to build. We and the G15 group of housing associations did a piece of work which estimates that we need 7 times that. So we need £4.9 billion a year from the government if we're to deliver the level of affordable housing, and most of that would be social rented housing that London needs. So there's a huge challenge, and of course coronavirus compounds many other challenges the sector was facing, not least combustible cladding remediation and Brexit uncertainty. Coronavirus is going to cause many problems across the construction sector, whether you're a private developer, whether you're a council, or whether you're a housing association. It's going to be a major issue. That's why we've established this housing recovery task force, which is bringing together all the key players in the sector in order to come up with a recovery plan. And I don't just want us to bounce back from this. I want us to be in a stronger position to deliver social and genuinely affordable housing.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to move on now to just ask the panelists to think a little bit about the future. And, we've talked quite a lot about the challenges of the current crisis. What do you think we can learn from the current crisis that we should take forward to the future? Are there particular lessons the crisis has taught us, and what does this mean for, long-term the housing market for regulation? Just a few thoughts on, I suppose, what you'd like us to take forward from this and what you'd like us to definitely leave behind at this period. Ben, Caitlin, then Tom, maybe.
I think, as I said earlier, it shows that we're actually in a really fragile environment. Things rocking along reasonably okay, notwithstanding some of the very valid challenges we've spoken about today. But all of a sudden, we've been 5 weeks into lockdown. We're not sure when we're going to come out exactly, and we've got people that are having really difficult situations, whether you're a landlord or a tenant. So I think the market is actually far more fragile than we thought, and we should reflect on that. I think longer term, we need to understand what we want the PRS to do, because actually the PRS it started out as being perhaps maybe for professionals, sharers and that type of thing, but actually it's got a number of segments in that market that now end up in the PRS, whether you're a student, whether you're a working professional, whether you're a family, or whether you are on universal credit or housing benefit. Whether or not that is quite the right place for all of those people, question mark for me, because actually what we're trying to do is we're trying to regulate the PRS, and we're thinking, okay, well, we need to make it fit for students, and they've got a set of requirements, and we've got families over here and they need this, that and the other. Actually, you can't necessarily cater for everybody, and I think we do need to reflect on that as we go into this sort of new era, because we shouldn't just repeat what's gone before.
Thank you. Caitlin.
Yeah, I think what this crisis has shown is that the PRS wasn't fit for purpose going into this crisis. As it grew over the last 20 years, and we put more and more people in a very expensive, very unstable and very fragmented tenure that's very difficult to regulate, because many landlords are, own just 1 or 2 properties. This crisis has shown just how fragile it is. I think, very few of the problems that we're seeing are new. I mean, insecurity of tenure, lack of affordability, people not knowing how to pay their rent or living in overcrowded, unsafe accommodation. These were things that, plenty of people in the housing sector were calling on government to address for years, for decades. And I think this crisis has shown just how little slack there is in the system. There's 2/3 of renters have no savings whatsoever. The figures for April show that in some landlords collected just half of rent, and so I think we have to make sure that when we leave this crisis, we redesign the PRS so that it provides genuinely secure and affordable accommodation that's fit for purpose and that's fit to live in.
Brilliant, thank you. And Tom, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with some of what Ben said and what Caitlin said. I think we do need to decide what the private rented sector is for. It's become something that it was never intended to be, and that's because it's a combination of right to buy and buy to let. Really, I mean, a lot of it was about was about those two things combined. In terms of what we can learn from the crisis, in some ways it's too early to say, but I think we can safely say that a lot of people will probably be looking for something rather different than they were looking for before in terms of housing. So let's take home working, for example. Home working probably now is going to become much more the norm than it was before. And that, for a lot of people, will raise the question of, well, now that I don't have to commute 5 days a week, do I want to live in this small flat in central London with no garden? Or do I want to move out to outer London, or indeed out of London altogether? That's going to have major implications, both for housing and for transport as well, and for where and what we invest in terms of infrastructure in the future. Now, we don't have any of the answers to these questions at the moment. We don't know to what extent that's going to happen. We don't know if after coronavirus, people decide they want to go back to normal, or whether it generates a fundamental shift where people want to move away from high density urban living. So I think we had to be prepared for the consequences, and prepared perhaps to challenge some of the assumptions that we had been making about this city and where it's going to be going in the future in terms of population and in terms of growth. Like I say, we can't say anything for certain at the moment, but it could have very profound implications in terms of how people want to live.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And can we have the results of the poll up now? Oh dear. I was hoping people were going to see an upside coming out of this, but no. I mean, I think people's feeling that conditions for renters will get fairly worse, not necessarily much worse, will get worse coming out of this crisis. So it feels there's a huge opportunity to grab to make sure that's not the case, and that actually conditions for London's renters and for London's housing market do get better across the line. We're coming towards the end now. We've had a lot of questions we've not been able to attend to. I'd just like to sort of highlight some of the issues raised there. People talking about rethinking housing, decommodifying housing, and thinking of housing more as a right for people living in the city, and different models of housing, such as cooperative living, that don't necessarily depend on the type of development model we have. And I know there's a lot of exploration of cooperative living in London and community-led housing. Some frustration, I think, about the way that housing is sold off plan and often sold to investors, and that potential owner occupiers don't really get much of a look in, and concerned about whether that's overseas or not. Concerns that that's not giving Londoners a fair crack of the whip, especially given where Londoners' incomes are. So, still some frustration there. But I think something we've picked up from all the panelists is the extent to which the whole system is feeling quite under pressure. It's not feeling like there's a lot of slack in it right now. And I think the risks of, I suppose, some stronger responses, whether there's a rent strikes or forced evictions, probably feel, without wishing to sound too centrist, probably feel quite problematic from both ends. But actually, there's a reasonable discussion to be had in the short term between landlords and tenants, and then a rethink of that relationship and how that bit of the market works over the longer term. I'm just going to go back to the panelists to see if they've got any last closing comments, and then we're going to wind up. Thank you very much, everyone. So perhaps I'll go to Caitlin first, then Tom, then Ben.
Yeah, I think this crisis has made us focus a lot more on what we want from our homes. We're spending unprecedented amount of time in our homes, and I think lots of private renters are seeing that they're not fit for purpose. And hopefully, I do have some optimism that this crisis will provoke a fundamental rethink of what a decent home means. It's not just a room in a shared house that might not be fit for purpose and in a big city. It's got to actually be somewhere that's safe, secure and affordable. So I think I'm slightly more optimistic than the audience, but there's a lot of work to do.
Great. Tom, your thoughts?
Yes, I completely agree with that. I think this is going to be a really important question going forward. It is important that we're building the number of homes that we need, but it's also important that we do have that focus on quality and on satisfying the demands of what people want from their home as well, particularly now, as Caitlin said, we've all been forced to spend 90% of our time here. There is, I think, as well, more broadly in housing, an opportunity to refocus how we do development, but that will require the government to come on board. I think we need to be looking much more at how we can deliver low-cost rented housing. If there's, I said previously, it was difficult to say, what the sort of outcomes of coronavirus would necessarily be in terms of how people want to live. But I think one thing is certain: there is going to be an increase in demand for already scarce socially rented housing, and I think that going into a recession, as we probably are, relying on the cross-subsidy model that we've had to rely on for the last, decade almost, it's just not sustainable. But that means the government stepping up and providing that financial support. And in terms of renters, we will continue to be making the case to the government as the mayor's desire for a London model, for a form of rent control in the longer term that will work for London, not just transplanting some system from another city, but coming up with a system that could genuinely work for London and protect renters.
Thank you. Ben, from Landlords' perspective.
Yeah, I think this webinar has probably showed that there's actually more that unites us than divides us when it comes to housing. And although we've got sort of rhetoric, at both of the peripheries there, actually, what landlords and tenants both want is a private rented sector that works for both of them. Actually, landlords want to provide, on the whole, decent homes and be treated fairly, and that's exactly what tenants want as well. Having a PRS that works for both groups of people is something that must be looked at post this crisis. We're obviously in the eye of the storm at the moment, and it's important for me to stress that landlords are hurting as much as tenants, and I think during this time of stress it's really important that we both work together, and we can look forward hopefully to a better PRS off the back of it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you very much to our three brilliant speakers, Caitlin, Ben and Tom. Thank you very much also to my Centre for London colleagues, Caroline and Deanna, who've been hiding in the background, making sure this all works. And thank you all for joining us. I think it's been as always, in an hour, you can scrape the surface of the discussion. And I suspect that if we went on, we'd go on for a few more hours and people might start having drinks and it would get even more heated. I think it has been really useful in highlighting some of the issues. I think it's been interesting, the range of views we've seen from the chat and from the questions. And clearly there are landlords feeling under a lot of pressure as well as tenants feeling under pressure. This is just one of the recovery events we're going to be doing. Please sign up to our newsletter on our website or follow us on @Centre for London on Twitter to keep up with our work. And if you're interested in supporting any of our work, engaging any of our work, please get in touch. We're planning to do something next week on transport, looking, I suppose, in particular at how London streets are responding to the crisis. A lot of boroughs independently are starting to make more road space available for walking and cycling. Again, are the lessons we can draw out of that? And is there more we could be doing at the moment to actually make the city in lockdown a place that's easier for people to move around? So dates and speakers on that to be confirmed. We're looking for dates in people's diaries. So thank you again to the speakers. Thank you to all for attending, and goodbye and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Cheerio.
Goodbye.
Thank you.